Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is a bit different for a couple of reasons. Partially because I'm mainly talking about nonfiction today, but also because I'm talking about something that's very much in the world and kind of to do with current affairs and something that is pretty important to me. And so, with everything going on in the news right now about the kind of new war with Israel and specifically Hamas in Gaza, I wanted to give some recommendations because I think it's clear that it's more important than ever that people educate themselves to perspectives that they maybe haven't heard before. And so today I'm sharing with you a list of a bunch of books, a bunch of resources on Palestine and kind of education materials and books and stories that can tell you about the history of Palestine and Israel, the history of the Palestinian struggle and the Israeli occupation. And yeah, I'm hoping this doesn't get taken down. But yeah, here's my list. And to preface, you might be asking, who am I as this random white guy to talk about this? Which is a really good question because at times like this, what we really should be doing is listening to the voices of the people most directly affected. And by that, I mean Palestinians. So please, look out Palestinian activists, Palestinian poets, Palestinian writers, and listen to them. But why I'm sharing this is because I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in modern Arab history, focusing specifically on the four countries of the Levant, which is Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. So, yeah, a lot of my master's coursework and research was on Palestine. So that's why I'm sharing with you these books today. And yeah, I'll try to keep it somewhat short, but these are some great books to read if you're interested in learning more about Palestine. So I've got three stacks here. The first stack is more introductory books. The first category is really books to read if you're somewhat new to learning about Palestine. And so the first one is actually by an Israeli scholar called Ilan Pape. And this is 10 Myths About Israel. This is a short book. It's a phenomenal book if you are new to learning about the issues in Palestine and with the Israeli occupation, as well as if you do already have some information and you're looking for some really good just facts and hard data. So Ilan Pape is an Israeli scholar, and he was one of the first kind of really key Israeli scholars on actually exposing the Israeli archives about kind of Israeli practices at the beginning of 1948 when the country was founded. So this book is structured. This is not one of his more academic books. This is one of his more public facing books. And yeah, it's structured around 10 myths about Israel. So it takes these ideas that we have about Israel and Palestine and then deconstructs them and shows how they are actually narratives that have been built up over time for specific political purposes. So one of them is that the Jewish people of Europe were a people with no land, with no home, and he kind of deconstructs that idea. And the inverse of that, which is that Palestine was a land without a people, and he deconstructs that and showing how Palestine was actually very much a thriving and important land during the Ottoman Empire and earlier. So, fantastic book, very accessible, digestible, great if you're just starting to learn. The next one is a really great history book that also, partially because of how it's structured, I find really accessible for new readers on the issue. And this is The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. Rashid Khalidi is a Palestinian man himself, a very well-respected scholar, and he's also worked, I believe, with the UN for a number of years, a number of decades, on Palestine and Israel, and on the I hesitate to say conflict, but on the kind of trouble in Israel and Palestine. So this book is fantastic, and yeah, the way it's structured is that it essentially looks at different declarations of war on Palestine by Israel and kind of internationally. So, looking at 1948, looking at 1967, the 1982 invasion of Lebanon from Israel. Fantastic book. Very accessible, like I said. Rashidi Khalidi is really interesting because this is not only just a really well-researched book in terms of, academics and the history, but being Palestinian himself, he's actually the grandson or the great-grandson of the mayor of Jerusalem back in the early 20th century. I think it was the mayor of Jerusalem. It might have been a different city. So he's got a personal archive. He's got primary sources and materials that he's looking at from his grandfather or great-grandfather. So fantastic book if you want a more kind of general history of the last 100 years or so on Palestine and the Israeli occupation of it. Next is Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics by Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick. Another short, quite accessible book. This book, its main argument or main purpose is showing how Palestine is always left out of progressive politics. Palestine is always on the periphery. So no matter how progressive American politics get, Israel seems to be its blind spot, right? Where they are not pushing for a dismantlement of apartheid systems there, colonial systems there, racist systems there. This book is interesting because it opens the question up wider than Palestine and Israel and looks specifically at how America has engaged with Palestine, both legally and kind of culturally and politically. Really great book by these two authors. That's all I'll say about this one. But this one kind of reminds me of the next one, which is Justice for Some by Noura Erakat. This is a really phenomenal book, and this is where it starts to get into maybe a little bit more advanced territory. Noura Erakat is a Palestinian woman, I think, living and working in America, and she's an international lawyer and a scholar. And this book, Justice for Some, is a really detailed look at international law and how it's applied to Israel and Palestine, and pointedly how it's not applied to Israel and Palestine. This is a really in-depth legal analysis of international legal systems and how they are brought to bear, or they're brought kind of down in punishment of Palestine, but not on Israel, and how the international kind of legal structures, similar to Except for Palestine, continuously treat Palestine unfairly, and it really just kind of grows from that to see how the kind of international system of politics and legal doctrine have really created a dual system where there is a certain law for Israel internationally and a very different law for Palestine internationally. The last book in this first section is actually a kind of different book in that it's not primarily about Palestine. But one of the things that I really learned in my bachelor's and my master's degree is that it's almost impossible to talk about the modern Arab world, no matter what country you're talking about in that Arab world, without talking about Palestine and without talking about the creation of Israel in 1948. So this book is called Beware of Small States by David Hurst. The subtitle is Lebanon, Battleground of the Middle East. So this is a history of Lebanon from, I forget when it starts. It's essentially a 20th century history of Lebanon. And it essentially, chronicles the coming out of the mandate system in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the early kind of independence era, and then spends a lot of time in the Lebanese Civil War, talking about the Civil War. And one of the ways the Civil War started was because of the Lebanese government, aided by kind of Israel, their treatment of Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon at the time. So this is quite a thick book, actually, and it's really in-depth at times, but it's very readable. It's very fast-paced. It sounds strange to talk about nonfiction and history books in that way, but it really is. It's very readable and accessible. Its scope is very large, and it's very empathetic and sympathetic towards Palestine and its place in modern Arab history, and it really shows the injustices being done, to Palestinians have reverberated throughout the rest of the Arab world. So fantastic book that gives you a bit more perspective on not just Palestine and the Israeli occupation, but how that issue fits in the larger Levantine kind of political structure and Arab political structure in general. Okay, this next category, again, is a little bit more advanced. This one is probably, these next two are probably the easiest of them. But if you have a little bit more knowledge and you're looking to just push it even further, this is a short book called On Palestine. Ilan Pappé, we've already mentioned. Ilan Pappé, Israeli scholar, and very famously Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is a very famous American scholar, activist, political writer. And yeah, this is their collective work, a series of essays that they each separately wrote, and I think a few that they co-wrote on Palestine. I won't say much more than that, but very much worth a read if you're looking to see, again, a bit more of an internationalist perspective on Palestine and the Israeli occupation. Next also shows a bit more of an international perspective and puts the Palestinian struggle kind of in conversation with a lot of other struggles for equality, for social justice, for humanistic values, and kind of deconstructing systems of oppression. And so this is Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle. So Ferguson Palestine and the Foundations of a Movement. So this is, again, another really short book by Angela Davis, who's a classic and deeply influential writer in America, coming primarily from the civil rights movements of the 1960s, but she's really touched on everything. One of her other big books is Are Prisons Obsolete? So she's very important in the abolitionist circles. And yeah, this is her book on kind of putting the Palestinian struggle in conversation with, systems of racial inequality in America and other systems. Classic kind of modern read for understanding this. Next, we're going back to Ilan Pappé again. He is really kind of a giant on the Israeli side of understanding the Palestinian struggle, something that's gotten him a lot of hate from Zionist circles and from the Israeli government. This is The Idea of Israel by Ilan Pappé. So this is, again, a more academic book that is more on the history of the idea of Israel. So the history of, the movements and the situations in Eastern Europe in the 19th century that pushed some Jewish thinkers towards kind of a Zionist political ideology, and then traces the kind of progression of that idea as it, moves from theoretical into the actual, the reality, essentially. Yeah, so this very much talks about the idea of, Israel as a postmodern state, right? A state that's actually built upon an idea instead of a land. Very kind of analytical look at the historiography of Israel more than anything else. Next is by one of the absolute giants of kind of modern Arab history, modern Middle Eastern studies, anti-Orientalist studies, and this is Edward Said, and this is his collection of essays, The Question of Palestine. So Edward Said is a Palestinian man who went to school, I believe, in Egypt and then in America, and he became, a very well-respected professor of English literature. And as his career progressed, he became more focused on Palestine and became more political and open in his advocacy. Another great book of his that shows the kind of work that he did is a book called Representations of the Intellectual. And in my opinion, Edward Said very much lived that ideal intellectual life, of speaking truth to power and using your knowledge, your privilege, and your voice to speak truth to power. So this is a collection of essays on Palestine, and the struggle for Palestinian liberation, the system of colonialism and apartheid that undergirds the Israeli state and its treatment of Palestinians. Really great collection of essays, much more academic in language, which is why I've got it where I have. This is definitely not the most accessible book if you're just learning about these things for the first time. But if you're looking to really get a pulse on, modern Arab studies and the way in which scholars talk about Palestine for the last, 30, 40 years, this is a classic. Fantastic book. The next goes back to a bit of an internationalist look, and this is The Colonial Present by Derek Gregory. This is quite an academic book. It's pretty dense in its language and its theory, and essentially it looks at the rebirth or the intensification of imperialism, specifically American imperialism, in the period immediately following 9/11. So it looks at the American invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, and the kind of increase of Israeli violence on Palestine, all in the wake of 9/11, or also known as the War on Terror. So this is a very theory-heavy book about how colonialism has never really gone away and how it's morphed, and the new language of colonialism in the modern era. All of these books are very grim, obviously. This is especially grim. This very much looks at the language of violence and the, violence as a tool used for imperialist purposes. This book and Noura Ereket's Justice for Some, I think, go great together, talking about legal structures around colonialism and imperialism. And it really shows how America and Israel are kind of hand in hand in creating new landscapes of imperialism. Okay, the last book in this section, and then I've just got one really brief section after this. But the last book in this section, again, is less connected to Palestine directly, but theoretically and fundamentally is very applicable even now. And this is The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. So this is one of two books that my thesis was actually based on. And this is an absolute classic in what's known as Decolonial Studies. So Frantz Fanon was born in Martinique under French colonial rule, became a doctor. He studied in France and became a psychiatrist. And as one of his first postings, he was sent to Algeria and was a psychiatrist in Algeria. And as the war for independence in Algeria started in 1954, he worked as a psychiatrist in hospitals treating both Algerian patients and French patients. So he was treating, both essentially victims of colonial torture as well as the actual torturers. So this is a incredibly grim, gory, and dark book. But it is foundational in understanding post-colonial studies, or decolonial studies more specifically. This book essentially, describes the colonial system and how it affects both the colonized and the colonizer, and then really creates a roadmap of, what the decolonial process, the process of decolonization looks like, and lays out all of the pitfalls that it often, falls victim to, of becoming a neo-colonial regime, and all of that. But I would especially say the first section on violence shows the nature of decolonization. And I think it's important to read that section and this entire book and to think about the questions Fanon asks, specifically when we talk about ideas of justification and justifying certain acts of violence, and how that in and of itself is a problematic question to ask in certain cases. I won't go into too much detail, but yeah, phenomenal book that is unfortunately very applicable to Palestine and Israel today, but to so many other situations, right? I mean, he was writing from the Algerian War for Independence, and this really stands as a giant in decolonial studies for so many parts of the world, right? For East Asia, South Asia, Africa, the Middle East, South America. This is really the giant of decolonial studies. Okay, and last but not least, I just have 3 short little books here. And this is less academic, although there's definitely an academic element to it, but this is literature and poetry. So I have 2 authors here. And these are 2 of the most famous Palestinian writers. The first of which was really kind of the unofficial cultural head of the Palestinian resistance for many years in the 1970s and 80s until he was assassinated by Israel. And this is a man named Ghassan Kanafani. And so I've got 2 novels of his here. I have the Arabic editions. So this is Rijal fil Shams, or also Men in the Sun. And I also have A'id ila Haifa, or Return to Haifa. So these are 2 very short novels. They're easily accessible in English. I just have the Arabic editions. And yeah, getting a pulse on the kind of literary aspects of the Israeli occupation and how it impacted, Palestinian culture, Palestinian identity, the struggles of living under occupation, mentally, physically, psychologically. Yeah, I mean, really, just these books, you can't kind of get better than these in understanding that. This one, A'id ila Haifa, is about a man and woman who were forced to flee Haifa in 1948 during the Nakba, and they are returning. It was either 1948 al-Nakba or 1967, which is called al-Naqsa, returning to Haifa for the first time since they were forced to flee by the Israeli occupation. And yeah, I won't spoil anything other than that, but deeply emotional, tragic, and thought-provoking book. And Rijal fil Shams deals with 3 Palestinian men living in Iraq as refugees, trying to get to Kuwait, and the just tragic journey that they go on. This one especially, I think, shows the kind of psychological impact of being a refugee, of being a stateless person, and of having your homeland destroyed. Something I cannot, fathom in a personal sense, but reading, Kanafani's words just portrays such brutal sympathy and empathy. Very difficult to read these books and not come out of it a little changed, I think. And last but not least, another very famous Palestinian writer, this time a poet. This is Mahmoud Darwish. I've got this collection called The Butterfly's Burden, which is actually a collection of collections. I would recommend all of his poetry, but specifically, this has, where is it? A State of Siege. This is a poem, a long-form poem that Mahmoud Darwish wrote while living in Gaza as it came under full siege. So he's writing about the idea and the realities of the Israeli siege on Gaza as he's living through it. It is a deeply visceral and emotional and uncomfortable poem. And yeah, Darwish is one of the literary and cultural giants of the Palestinian resistance, and definitely a figure to look into for his other writings and interviews and things like that. So that's it. Those are my recommendations. The last few days have been brutal, seeing the developments of the war against Gaza, and the resurgence of violence in the West Bank. And yeah, I won't go on too much more for fear of getting this video taken down. But I will share these resources, and I hope that people come to them with an open mind, with an interest in actually learning, as opposed to, an ideological interest of proving a point or anything like that. So those are some great resources to read if you're new to the idea of Palestine and the Palestinian struggle, or if you are coming from a more advanced place and looking for further resources. So yeah, I hope you read some of these, and I hope you learn. If you've got any other resources you'd love to share with me, I'm always looking to learn more. So please share. And thank you so much for listening, and I will hopefully be back with more videos soon.